of a three-part series about migration within the United States. Not how people got here, but how and why they moved around and where they moved to. In part one, we saw how the United States government took away the lands of the Native Americans on which they had been living for thousands of years and just give it to the local settlers. We traced the movement from east to west and took a look at the gold rush. This program starts with the movement of people from farms to cities, and then comes together around the themes of war and crisis. The two world wars and the Depression. Wars often move people around, and the labor force demands of World War I quickened the move of people from farms to cities and started the great migration of African Americans from the South. World War II doubled and tripled the number of folks moving in the same directions. The Depression slowed migration as worried people stayed close to home. And the Dust Bowl migration was driven by environmental as well as economic problems. At the end of World War I, the shift in population from the farm to the city became the subject of a popular song.
How you gonna keep them down on the farm after they've seen Harry? How you gonna keep them away from Broadway jazzing around, painting the town?
A more accurate question would have been, how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen the farm? Once again, as he did in part one of this series, Stuart Schoen will be joining me and sharing his knowledge and insight to migration in the United States.
Well, I reckon this is where we'll find some of them city clothes.
What does reckon mean?
I don't know, I just thought it was appropriate.
Okay. I also appreciate his sense of humor. He was actually able to endure my absurd behavior for an entire week.
The next significant migration was the one from farm to city. A nation of farmers became a nation of city dwellers. It drastically changed what people did for a living and their way of life. Power shifted from the farm belt to the cities.
Teeming millions, never more than a copper coin from starvation.
Through most of history, our primary objective was to get something to eat. In the beginning, it was all about hunting and gathering. After a few 100,000 years, we figured out how to farm and domesticate a few animals. Subsistence agriculture was what life was all about.
The earliest cities that we know of were in Mesopotamia and Egypt. They were market towns where people exchanged stuff for other stuff and did a little small-scale manufacturing. But in the late 1700s, everything changed. Advances in farming techniques reduced the number of people needed on the farms to feed the population of a nation. So the farmers headed to the cities.
Very impressive.
Hey, thank you. I have to tell you though, I usually only look like this if there's a shareholder meeting. The United Nations predicts that by 2050, 86% of the people who live in the developed nations will be living in cities. That's about 3 billion people.
And how do you define a developed nation?
I don't know. Let's ask Siri. Siri, what's the definition of a developed nation?
Okay, I found this on the web for what's the definition of a developed nation.
A developed nation is considered to be a sovereign state that has a highly developed economy and an advanced technological infrastructure, often measured by the gross domestic product.
Interesting. Based on the behavior of many of our politicians, I'd say we have the capacity to be extraordinarily gross. And speaking of politics, one of the things I want to talk about in this program is how our state governments have often introduced laws that interfered with our right to move around this country, and how your dad and his friends worked to make it easier for all of us to get around. Joe Schoen is the CEO of U-Haul and played an active part in getting our state governments to change their laws so people could move around our country.
This whole freedom of movement is almost a characteristic of Americans. But of course, different government entities think they have a reason to kind of try to regulate this. And so U-Haul has functioned as a champion to ensure that a person with a standard driver's license would be entitled to use and drive a vehicle large enough they could actually do a relocation move.
Our government tries to track population movements, but sometimes it takes years to compile their data. The primary reason I wanted to make this program with U-Haul is that they know what's happening every day.
By 1955, we were faced with people from the east moving to the west. And you could see it because the equipment would continue to always have more equipment in the west than you did in the east. And then by about 1965, it began to go from the north to the south. And by maybe 1985, it was all leaving the west, California particularly, and moving to the Sun Belt and to the further into the south. So you can see these migration patterns very quickly, because if we start off with 100 pieces of equipment in a city, well, the inventory either grows or declines. And so you very quickly see where people are heading. So today, one of the huge moves is people moving back into urban cores.
These days I live with my family in Switzerland. And to live here legally, I had to apply to the federal government for a permit. But I also had to apply to the state government and the city government and the town government. I needed 4 separate permits to live here. And if I want to move, I got to go through the whole thing all over again. State, city, town. The freedom of movement in the United States made it possible for us to develop a really strong economic base.
And there's these psychic rewards to being a leader and leading your group, your family, from one place to another. It's not easy. And I think that many of our families have our own unique stories of how we got to where we are. And usually those stories have a main character, which is somebody made a bold decision to do something, and everybody got behind it, and that's how we got here.
Give me that old time religion. Give me that old time religion. Give me that old time religion. It's good enough for me. It was for my mother.
In 1910, there were about 10 million African Americans in the United States, and about 90% lived in the South. But during a 20-year period from 1910 to 1930, over 1 million African Americans voluntarily moved north. I say voluntarily because there were relocations of African Americans that were not voluntary. This one was. There were a number of reasons for this particular resettlement. Since the middle of the 1800s, European immigrants were coming to the United States and filling industrial jobs. World War I got started in 1914 and put an abrupt end to that source of labor. And the need to manufacture material for the war made the shortage of labor even more acute. And then there was the boll weevil.
Oh, the boll weevil lamb, a little black bug, come from Mexico, they say. Come all the way to Texas, just a-looking for a place to stay, just a-looking for a home, just a-looking for a home.
A boll weevil is a minuscule beetle that is probably native to South America. In 1898, thousands of them slipped past the U.S. Border Patrol and crossed in from Mexico to Texas. From a gastronomic viewpoint, Texas was a boll weevil's promised land. A boll weevil's favorite meal consisted of cotton flowers and cotton seeds, and Texas was a major cotton-growing state. The weevils also started to eat their way east, and in the process devastated the cotton farms of the South and put an end to the cotton-based economy of the southern states. Thousands of farm workers suddenly had no work. Bottom line, in the South there wasn't much work, and what there was didn't pay very much. In addition, there was the constant suppression and intimidation of the African American community. There was a total lack of political rights, the constant fear of arbitrary violence, and the spectacle of lynchings. The idea that African Americans might be able to move to a place where they could live in dignity was a powerful force. In the North, there was a great demand for workers. Pay was considerably higher than wages in the South, and the general environment for African Americans was noticeably better. And in many places, they were able to register and vote. Businesses went to great lengths to bring Southern workers north. They had company representatives on the streets of the southern cities offering train tickets to young men who looked like they were in physically good shape. Suddenly, there was migration madness. Letters came back from people who moved north and were read out loud in the churches. By and large, the message was the same. Not perfect, but much better. Come north. And not all the people who moved north were agricultural laborers who were out of work. Some of the migrants came from towns like Birmingham and Bessemer, where they worked in steel mills and mines. But the majority were sharecroppers. The city that received the most number of new residents was New York. New York was followed by Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, and Pittsburgh. There's a part of the United States that we call the Great Plains. It runs north to south from Canada to Texas, and east to west from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains.
When early European and American settlers saw the area, they quickly realized that the region was not a great place for European-style farming. Very little surface water and almost no timber. They called it the Great American Desert and moved on.
However, in the 1860s, our federal government, the guys who built the Transcontinental Railroad, and a group of real estate promoters decided that the plains should be developed, and to encourage people to move there, the government passed the Homestead Act.
If you had never taken up arms against the U.S. government, were 21 years or older, or the head of a family, including freed slaves and women, and agreed to live on and work the land, the government would give you 160 acres.
The law was signed by President Lincoln with the encouragement of Northern interests. They wanted the land to be farmed by the farmers who owned it and not by plantation owners using their slaves. A number of elements came together to make it quite interesting to homestead on the Great Plains.
World War I reduced the available food supply and increased agricultural prices.
Technological improvements in farming equipment made it possible to farm large tracts of land. And a number of years with lots of rain made the Great Plains a temporarily attractive region.
There was little to no understanding of the local ecology. And in a rush for profits, the native vegetation that held the topsoil in place was destroyed.
When the drought conditions returned, the topsoil turned to dust, and giant clouds of soil blackened the sky. The earth just blew away. Over 100 million acres became useless.
On the heels of the unemployed came the victims of the Dust Bowl, as the Columbia beckoned to a people burned out by wind and drought.
Tens of thousands of families abandoned their farms and moved in search of work. But it was not only the farmers who migrated out of the Great Plains. Some of the migrants were white-collar professionals and small business owners. And to make things even worse, the 1930s were the years of the Great Depression.
The next great migration was the result of the Second World War. It lasted from 1939 to 1945, and in one way or another involved every country on the planet. The primary participants devoted their entire economy, industrial and scientific capabilities to the conflict. The distinction between civilian and military resources disappeared. It's estimated that over 60 million people died in the war, making it the most deadly conflict in human history. It also resulted in one of the greatest relocations of Americans. Millions of people changed their residences during the war. Between 1940 and 1945, 16 million Americans were called to military service, and many were sent to bases across the country, with family members often trailing behind.
Hey guys, wait up! Wait for me!
By the way, this aircraft is a consolidated PB-4Y-2 privateer. It was a U.S. Navy patrol bomber during World War II and in Korea.
America, fighting a global war, calls on its shipbuilders for vessels of every type and description.
The war years saw millions of families leave farms and small towns to take jobs in the defense industries. These were often long-distance moves. The older industrial centers were key to the defense buildup, but the federal government also located shipyards in California and aircraft plants on the Pacific and Gulf coasts. During the 1940s, California, Oregon, and Washington gained more than 3 million newcomers. The West was starting to industrialize.
Here is America's answer. It can be done.
Henry Kaiser developed a technique for building wartime ships by prefabricating each major section.
And here is one of the miracle men of United States shipbuilding, Henry J. Kaiser. With an 81-piece model of the famous Liberty ship, Mr. Kaiser shows how the 10,000-ton vessels are actually constructed.
It's always interesting for me to see the old films that we made to support our efforts in World War II. Now, even if they're not completely accurate, they do paint a picture of our nation at its best. And that was the nation I grew up in.
For every combat craft that seeks the blue for Uncle Sam, we require 2 training ships to prepare our men for flight.
The returning servicemen and women, they were relocating from where they'd been deployed in the military. But additionally, at that time, the whole move from the farm to the cities was coming kind of to its total, its grandest phase. People were leaving farms in droves as they became more mechanized. They were moving to cities.
The Second World War moved people from one part of the country to another. And as the war came to an end, many people moved back to where they lived originally. But many stayed in the towns and cities they had moved to because of the war. The newcomers changed the makeup of the older communities, which required a high level of tolerance between all groups. That was particularly true in San Francisco. The people who had rushed to California to find gold came from all over the world. They represented different cultures, different philosophies, and different religions. They needed to learn to work together and be understanding of their differences. And that same need to be open-minded about other people's beliefs and lifestyles that was so much a part of the gold rush period made San Francisco a center of the world's gay community. A key moment in the redistribution of Americans in the United States took place at the end of the war in Europe. The United States government decided to muster out anyone in the military who they suspected of being gay. The primary objective was to keep gay troops from going into the war in the Pacific, and the town they decided to do that in was San Francisco.
One of the more densely populated cities of the United States. People have gathered here for reasons of commerce, shipping, industry, and some just for the sheer pleasure of living in this picturesque city which rises sharply out of the Pacific Ocean.
The discharge papers that were issued to gay people in the military clearly indicated that they were being discharged because they were gay, which made it impossible for them to return to their hometowns. So they stayed in San Francisco and created their own community. The Second World War was also the catalyst that brought many African Americans to San Francisco. Word had spread throughout the Southeast that there were good jobs in war-related industries, and thousands of African Americans resettled in California.
America makes ready ships and guns and planes and men, determined to provide for the common defense, to make secure our priceless heritage, the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity.
The blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, but not for all of us.
A caravan of Japanese-owned trucks and pleasure cars heads inland from the Pacific. Aliens ordered out of strategic coastal zones, they are allowed all the personal belongings and household goods they can carry.
Now the actual migration got underway. The Army provided fleets of vans to transport household belongings and buses to move the people to assembly centers. The evacuees cooperated wholeheartedly.
One of the most tragic migrations during the Second World War was the forced relocation of over 100,000 Japanese Americans to 10 internment camps.
Evacuees were met by an advance contingent of Japanese who had arrived some days earlier and who now acted as guides. Naturally, the newcomers looked about with some curiosity.
Most of the people interned were American-born loyal citizens. The United States government just rounded up Japanese families and moved them to what should really be described as prison camps.
The government is erecting model camp towns, towns in which they'll live unmolested, not as prisoners, but free to work and paid by the United States government.
The word used to portray these events is internment. It sounds rather civilized.
Bathtubs, yes, all the comforts of home.
But if you look it up in a dictionary, you find that it means imprisonment.
While they have many things in common with ordinary American communities, in the really important things, relocation centers are not normal and probably never can be.
And in this case, it was imprisonment without any of the rights or due process that are given to a common criminal. You could rob a bank and get a better deal than you got as a loyal American citizen if you were of Japanese ancestry.
In small towns as well as large, up and down the coast, the moving continued. Behind them, they left shops and homes they had occupied for many years.
As Mark Twain pointed out, history does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes.
Escorted by troopers, they go to make their homes under Uncle Sam's surveillance for the duration.
The internment of over 100,000 American citizens and legal residents of Japanese ancestry echoes the Trail of Tears, when the U.S. government ordered the relocation of the Native American tribes. Change Indian reservation to Japanese internment camp, and you've got a similar story.
Well, that's part 2 of our series on migration within the United States.
Farm to city, African Americans out of the South, the Dust Bowl, and World War II. I hope you'll join us for part 3. We'll take a look at the move from cities to suburbs, the migration to the Sun Belt, and the shift back to the gentrified cities. For Travels and Traditions, I'm Burt Wolf. But wait, there's more. Whenever we edit one of our programs, we always end up with more good material than we can fit in. Interviews, stories, recipes. So we decided to put them on our website, burtwolf.com.